So that's a representative sample of hundreds of voters who have spoken up against the legislation in Texas. It is up to us now in Congress to listen to the cries for help that are coming from Texas and from other states, and to take action on comprehensive voting rights legislation in the House and in the Senate. I'll now recognize myself for an opening statement, then go to my friend, Mr. Sessions, for his opening statement. Good morning, and I want to thank our witnesses for being with us today on the occasion of this truly historic hearing. And we know it's taken a lot for you to get here, and we appreciate very much your being here and helping to educate Congress and the country about what's going on in Texas. Before we get into that, though, I want to take a moment, and I think it's not inappropriate, to mark the passing of a great voting rights hero and a great hero of mine, Bob Moses, who died on Sunday. And Bob Moses was a graduate student in mathematics and philosophy at Harvard in 1960, when he opened up the newspaper and he saw pictures of students sitting in from North Carolina AT&T at lunch counters in the South. And he said, those students look the way that I feel. And he knew that he had to go down south to participate in the civil rights movement, the struggle for people to be on a plane of equality as citizens. And when he got down to Mississippi, he thought he was going to be involved in a movement to try to desegregate the lunch counters and the restaurants. And he talked to a man down there named Amzie Moore, who was the head of the local NAACP, and he said, you know, we don't really need people sitting in the restaurants and lunch counters. And Bob Moses said, well, what do you need? And he said, well, when you look around, what do you see? And he said, I see beautiful terrain and trees and people. And he said, this is a congressional district that is 2/3 African American, and less than 1% of the black people down here are registered to vote because of the grandfather clauses and the literacy tests and the poll taxes. And the local Democratic Party, a racist party structure, has excluded African Americans from voting. And that's what launched Bob Moses on his crusade with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to desegregate Mississippi and Alabama and the rest of the South and the country. And it was that struggle that gave us the phrase, one person, one vote. Each person has a right to vote. And of course, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee organized people to register at great personal risk. Bob Moses was nearly killed several times by Klansmen, by sheriffs, by people who came to attack him. Of course, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman were killed during the Freedom Summer that SNCC organized. But Bob Moses never gave up the struggle for people's voting rights, and went on also to create the Algebra Project, saying that the right to know mathematics is also a fundamental civil right in our country. So I wanted to note that and observe that, and I wanted to start on a bipartisan note, that the struggle for the right to vote has been a struggle against all political parties in our history. And nobody has clean hands here when you look at it historically. The question is whether we are willing to commit ourselves to a struggle that extends the right to vote for everyone. It's not a partisan question. It's a question about small d, democracy for everybody. So earlier this year, legislators in Texas unveiled perhaps the most aggressive set of proposals for voting restrictions anywhere in the country, 65 different anti-voter bills, dramatic restrictions on mail-in voting, vastly increased criminal liability for people who help their family or their friends to vote or bring their ballots to the mailbox, increasingly stringent voter ID requirements, and more criminalization of what goes on in the polling place, enhanced protections for partisan poll workers who set out to intimidate voters, and additional limits on how election officials encourage voters to participate. At one point, and somebody's going to have to explain this to me, it's made a crime to encourage people to vote. I think if I'm reading this proposal correctly, they make it a crime to encourage people to vote. I don't see how that possibly can square with the First Amendment of the United States. I openly encourage people to vote all over the country and in Texas right now. Can that actually be a crime, to do it either on TV or in the social media or in person, talking to people, encouraging them to vote? There was even, I think in the first draft of this legislation, an effort to restrict early voting hours on Sunday, a clear attempt, at least as it was read in Texas, to undercut and hamstring black churches, which ran souls to the polls turnout operations. All of this is taking place despite zero evidence of mass voter fraud in Texas. None of it. Lots of invocations of integrity of the ballot, purity of the ballot. Well, those are code words that go back centuries now. I mean, some people see impurity of the ballot when they see people they don't like voting. So we want to get to the bottom of that. Is there widespread voter fraud in Texas that this is responding to, or is something else going on? One thing I read about was that a Texas legislator introduced just this month a bill calling for a forensic audit of the state's 2020 results, but only in large counties won by President Biden. And when asked why he had not included all the counties in Texas, he said, quote, "What's the point? I mean, all the small counties are red." How can that be consistent with our bipartisan, I'll go beyond that, nonpartisan? Let's not even say bipartisan, because a lot of people are sick of both of the parties. How about just a nonpartisan commitment for everybody to have the right to vote unimpeded, without jumping through all of these hoops? Democratic state representatives in Texas, including our witnesses today, organized a walkout in May to deny Republicans a quorum at the end of their session, preventing passage of the voting bill that would strip their constituents of access to the ballot. In response, Governor Abbott convened a special session on July 8th to pass this sweeping, draconian new election overhaul. Democrats once again denied the legislature a quorum, this time by coming here, petitioning the U.S. Congress for a redress of grievances, demanding the attention of a country that is committed to fairness in voting, to come to urge us to protect their voting rights. And they've done this at great personal cost, at great personal risk, by leaving their families behind. And I, for one, salute them for their courage in being here today. But blocking a quorum is not a permanent solution to the problem of efforts to disenfranchise people and suppress the vote in America. They're here to ask us to act, and we must pass the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. The cost of inaction will be devastating for our democracy. The voting restrictions in Texas will strike at the heart of democracy in that great state. Restrictions on voter assistance will potentially criminalize normal interactions between friends and family members who may require assistance to cast a ballot because they're not proficient in English, because they need a ride to the polls. It could have devastating consequences, especially in the Latino community. You cannot out-organize a law that criminalizes you for trying to help your grandmother vote. Limits on what local election officials can do to prevent intimidation by partisan poll workers will also leave minority voters vulnerable. Just last year, leaked video showed GOP Texas officials aimed to organize election integrity brigades of 10,000 largely white poll watchers to monitor communities of color in Houston. Imagine how many brigades there will be once poll workers have, as the ACLU of Texas puts it, a one-time get-out-of-jail-free card for voter intimidation. Because there's a remarkable provision, I've never seen anything like it, in this legislation, which says that a partisan poll worker cannot be removed from the polls until they've already been warned once for violating the law. So they get one free bite at the apple to violate the law, and I do want to ask the witnesses about that. Finally, this bill prohibits reforms that were successfully implemented last year by Harris County, such as drive-through voting and 24-hour voting, that were mainly utilized by African American and Latino voters. The Texas Civil Rights Project estimates that over half of all ballots cast using those methods were cast by voters of color. So this zealous pursuit of a massive draconian crackdown on voting is now a national crisis. According to the Brennan Center, 18 states have enacted 30 laws restricting voting rights so far this year. More are on the way. Congress has to act. We have a responsibility to guarantee the people of the United States a Republican form of government. And I'm sorry, my dear friends, that's not a capital R Republican, it's a small r. It's a Republican form of government, a representative form of government where everyone can vote and participate. And they can choose Republicans or Democrats or Libertarians or Independents, whatever else. But the point is, the people get to decide. We don't get to micromanage and gerrymander the electorate. We have to fight back against this new campaign for voter suppression, sparked by the big lie, the same big lie which brought chaos and violence down on this institution and this Capitol just 6 months ago. And for anyone who has not watched our valiant police officers describe what took place on that day, I beseech you to do so. Regardless of what you think your views are now, I beg you to go and watch what they went through as they were assaulted with baseball bats, steel pipes, flag poles, bear spray, mace for 4 or 5 hours defending our democracy. And all of that took place to so-called stop the steal in the name of the big lie, which is that President Biden did not actually defeat Donald Trump by more than 7 million votes, which he did. This wave of legislation, I think, grows out of that same poisonous soil of the big lie. The future of democracy is in our hands. So with that, I offer my friend, Mr. Sessions, the time that he needs to make his opening statement, and then we will go to our witnesses. Mr. Sessions.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that because this is a hearing specifically about Texas, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to have Governor Greg Abbott's order about that special session entered into the record.
Without any objection at all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the work of the state of Texas is very important, and the people of the state of Texas have duly qualified and elected individuals who would represent them. It has become a common cited effort that people, when they know they do not have the votes, to leave, to walk out, to not participate. And I don't know where all this came about, but I know that here in Washington, D.C., we do not have the votes to win any single vote, so to speak. None. But Republicans don't walk out. We don't go and accuse people of things just because we are losing. And I would suggest to you that what is happening today in Texas is the rights of all Texans are being withheld because members of the Democratic Party, who are members of the state House, choose not to be a part of it. So the question is, what is some of this that's being withheld? Well, one of them is the election integrity bill. We're going to talk about that election integrity bill in detail. And I think that anyone that listening to this will recognize that the strength of any majority or member of that body to bring forth a bill that they believe would be important is important. Whether it's complete or not, that process would involve each of the members who would be here to offer amendments to that to change it. But members are still allowed to represent their particular constituents with what they do. Second, border security. As a result of President Biden's decision on January 20th to literally tell federal law enforcement officers that they will not enforce the laws, the border laws, the immigration laws, and the common sense laws of this country, has placed a tremendous burden, and it is an emergency in Texas. Over 1 million illegal immigrants have entered the United States. Record numbers of drugs are coming in the United States. And essentially, these federal officers that were there to protect the United States of America, not just our sovereignty, but to protect people who might live in my hometown of Waco, Texas, from drug cartels that are sending record levels of fentanyl, cocaine, and meth to our American cities and homes. Third, family violence education is now not moving forward in Texas. This is based upon their ability to provide appropriate and more education to middle and high school students about dating violence, domestic violence, and child abuse, to recognize that what is happening in this country is we have a crisis in our homes. One could say because of COVID, I say because of the changing times. And we need to use our schools to educate our students about these circumstances. Number three, youth sports. There is going to be a bill that is presented that disallows a student from competing in university interscholastic league athletic competitions designed for students of the opposite sex. I believe it's fair to have the debate and a vote and to see the different ideas that come forth about that opportunity where people of one sex would compete against another person of that sex that I believe is unfair to women. I think it's an anti-women circumstance that we're involved in. I had children. I competed when I was in high school, and it's unfair to have a 17-year-old boy compete against a 17-year-old girl in most sports. 13th check. This is legislation that the House has before it to give teachers a 13th check during the year, allowing teachers a chance to have not only more supplemental payments and benefits, but it's to allow them at a time when more money is available in the teacher retirement system, but it requires the legislature to act. Next, property tax relief. The proposal is to allow the legislature to provide appropriations from general fund to give property tax relief to all Texans. These are important issues that need to be done, the business of the people of the state of Texas. And today, in essence, we're allowing and coddling people who should be at work in the state of Texas, their constitutional duties, and yet we're treating them as hometown heroes in Washington, D.C. I believe that they need to have their constitutional duties performed and be back home. Now, Mr. Chairman, Texas has been a pioneer in passing early voting laws that began in 1988 in Texas. But I would say to you that Texas has used every 2 years for the legislature to be able to strengthen these laws and to provide feedback and to allow Texans the opportunity to vote. I would note that Texas allows 17 days more of early voting than Delaware, which is where our president is from. Texas allows each Texan 17 days more than the state of Delaware. These bills that will be talked about today keep the ability for disabled or elderly persons to vote curbside. That's important to me. I have a disabled son. Perhaps my son may or may not want to go inside. He can stay outside. It allows that. We need to also remember that these discussions are discussions open to amendment. These bills would make sure that voters have a right to cure their absentee ballots of mistakes. And they're given in these bills up to 6 days after the election to be able to cure a mistake if you had one. This is a far cry from Democrats' claim that the vote is being suppressed. It actually allows them an opportunity to figure out if they had done something wrong. That is common in both the Senate and the House bills. Transparency is necessary in elections, and this bill guarantees elections observers free from any political persuasion. We heard our chairman today lament that partisan poll workers would be discouraged. Let me repeat. He believes, evidently, that partisan poll workers should be involved in that process. We disagree in Texas. We think anyone that comes to vote should be free of partisan poll workers engaged in an election site. We believe that Texas Democrats understand these bills because many of the people and several of the people that are here today sought amendments to those amendments, and they were accepted in the bills and the processes that have gone on. One member has been a member of the legislature for a number of years and no doubt knows that the laws of Texas that are updated every 2 years are done in the best interest of all Texans. But rather than continuing the debate, they broke quorum and they're trying to paralyze the progress that would be made on behalf of all Texans. Mr. Chairman, I hope today that the testimony that we are going to offer today from a State Representative Clardy, in particular, will allow those elected representatives who are Republicans in Texas a chance to set the record straight about not only what is in these bills, but the need to make sure that Texas works together and passes these laws for the benefit of all Texans. I yield back my time.
Mr. Sessions, thank you so much. We have two other opening statements. We have the chair of the Committee on Oversight and Reform, Ms. Maloney, and she is now recognized for her opening statement.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman Raskin, for convening today's urgent and vital hearing. I want to thank you for your leadership on this issue and your enduring commitment to the legacy of our late Chairman, Elijah Cummings, and our late colleague, Representative John Lewis, who both fought tirelessly to protect Americans' right to vote. This is a historic hearing, not just because of our distinguished witnesses, but because of the brave actions they took to defend the rights of Texans against one of the most aggressive attempts at voter suppression we have seen anywhere in the country. Now more than ever, we must follow their example to ensure that these shameful attacks on the right to vote do not succeed. We must fight to fulfill the American promise that voters choose their elected representatives rather than politicians picking their own voters. When it comes to restricting the right to vote, our nation has an ugly past. Historical voter suppression measures included threats of lynching, poll taxes, and literacy tests. Today, Texas remains the hardest state in the entire country for Americans to vote. Texans has repeatedly refused to implement reforms that would support greater voter engagement. In 2013, the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder blocked the Department of Justice from overseeing elections in places that historically discouraged and suppressed the votes of Black, Latino, and other communities of color. Since that decision, Texas has renewed its voter suppression with a vengeance. It has closed 750 polling sites, including 452 polling sites in counties with the largest increases in Black, Latino voters and more than any other state in the union. Now, Texan Republicans are trying to add new restrictions to voting. Let's be clear about these bills, what they are and what they are not. These bills are not an effort to make voting in Texas more secure. These bills are part of a racist campaign to decide who gets the right to vote. These bills takes power and choice away from the people of Texas and let the politicians decide who their voters are. Simply put, these bills are an attack on voters and on the rights guaranteed by the Constitution. But there is a solution. Congress must act. Congress must pass the For the People Act, which would end institutional barriers to voting and ensure all eligible voters can register and cast their ballot. Congress also must pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act to restore and strengthen the landmark Voting Rights Act. We must seize this moment to restore the vision of America as a nation of rights, where government derives its power from the people, not the other way around. Representative Thompson, Representative Collier, Representative Bernal, thank you for your bravery and fearless commitment to protecting voting rights. To our other witnesses, thank you for being here today. I thank my colleagues and I yield back.
Thank you so much, Chairman Maloney. Before I recognize Mr. Comer, I'm going to ask unanimous consent to waive on for the purposes of questioning only Mr. Vesey and Mr. Sarbanes. And without objection, we will waive them on. And I now get to recognize the ranking member of the full Oversight Committee, Mr. Comer.
Thank you, Chairman. The hearing title today claims there's an assault on voting rights in Texas, which would be very troubling if it were true, but it isn't. Your hearing title implies a big lie. Today, Democrats are holding a hearing meant to convince us of the necessity of their bill, H.R. 1, that would federalize elections across this country, funnel taxpayer money to politicians, and prevent common sense and popular integrity measures such as voter ID. Once again, Democrats are engaging in spectacle over substance while conducting no real oversight. There are multiple ongoing crises in our country that need to be addressed. Americans are suffering as a result of President Biden's inflation, border, and crime crises. We have asked repeatedly for a hearing on President Biden's border crisis, including the welfare of migrant children who have been held past the legal time frame in crowded facilities in the middle of a pandemic. Yet Democrats have held no hearings, nor have called on Biden administration officials to answer pressing questions about the gross mismanagement at the southern border. We've also called for hearings on other areas of waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement in the federal government, our committee's core mission. But Democrats have ignored these requests. Because federal bureaucrats have not returned to the workplace, veterans have waited for almost a year, for their records from the National Archives and Records Administration. This massive backlog is delaying the benefits to which they are entitled, yet no hearings from this committee. Hundreds of billions in pandemic unemployment relief have been stolen by international crime organizations. Again, there's been no hearing to understand how U.S. taxpayer dollars were so badly managed or the damage it caused to our national security. No wonder the Democrats on this committee received an F in congressional oversight by the Lugar Center. Americans deserve better. Instead of conducting real oversight, Democrats are holding a hearing to celebrate their theatrical exit of over 50 Texas Democrat legislators from their state to prevent debate on legislation they simply don't like. These Democrats fled Texas and paralyzed the Texas House, which cannot proceed with debate or voting legislation important to Texans, including voting integrity measures. During their super spreader stunt, Democrats flew to D.C. in 2 private charter jets, stayed in downtown hotels, met with the Vice President, the Speaker, and other congressional leaders. They spread COVID-19 all over D.C. and made sure to share their vacation experience all over social media to fundraise for their campaign and expenses. Unfortunately, this stunt likely pushed D.C. into the substantial spread zone, and we know what that will mean for our children. No in-person school as Democrats continue their quest to command and control our lives. If these Democrats actually cared about voting rights, they would care about the right of Texans to have their voice heard through their duly elected representatives. Their childish theatrics prevented the entire state legislature from debating and voting on important matters during the special session. Their actions have disenfranchised all voters throughout the state of Texas. The Texas bills being debated provide common sense voting integrity measures such as extending a simple voter ID requirement to absentee ballots and standardizing and expanding early voting access. Unfortunately, because Texas Democrats fled their state for Washington, that process cannot proceed as designed. I hope our committee will see the light in this partisan charade and start conducting real oversight. The American people are counting on us to safeguard their government from waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement. That's the reason this committee exists. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Comer, for your opening statement. And I do want to remind the committee members we're operating under the rules and guidance of the Capitol physician, which is please have your masks on when you're not speaking. Thank you, Mr. Comer, for demonstrating good public health manners there. And members will not be recognized if they're not wearing their masks when they're not speaking. It's now my great privilege and honor to introduce our witnesses today. Our first witness is the Honorable Synfronia Thompson, Texas State Representative and member of the Select Committee on Constitutional Rights and Remedies of the Texas Legislature. Then we will hear from Nina Perales, who's Vice President of Litigation at the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Next, we'll hear from the Honorable Nicole Collier, Texas State Representative and Chair of the Texas Legislative Black Caucus. Next, we'll hear from the Honorable Travis Clardy, who's a representative in the Texas State Legislature. And finally, we'll hear from the Honorable Diego Bernal, Texas State Representative and member of the Mexican-American Legislative Conference. The witnesses will please rise or be unmuted so we can swear them all in. Wherever you are, please raise your right hands. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give us is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
I do.
Let the record demonstrate that the witnesses all answered in the affirmative. Thank you very much. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. With that, Representative Thompson, you are now recognized for your testimony. Before you begin, I want to recognize also the presence of our distinguished colleague from Texas, Ms. Lizzie Fletcher from Houston. Representative Thompson, you're recognized for your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Raskin and Ranking Member Sessions. We were honored to see our colleagues from Texas. Pete Sessions, it's always good to see you. Chippewa came over early, and we had an opportunity to chat with him for a moment. And, of course, we are happy to see the new freshman colleague up here, Pat Fallon. We miss him in Texas, but we know he's doing a good job up here. Mr. Chairman, I was sitting there listening to the comments, opening statements that was made, and I had to take a step back and kind of look at the history that I have been able to perceive in Texas, but it is very difficult for me to look at the history or the progress that maybe African Americans may have made in this country without looking back at the struggles that we have gone through and the struggles that we keep going through. I can understand the position of some of the person who has spoke earlier because they have been a part of the privileged society that I have never been a part of. What I have been concerned about listening to them is their inability to be able to stand in other people's shoes and recognize that the rights that they take for granted to vote in this country, even though we're Americans, we don't all share those same rights. I just want to just digress a minute, if I can. I'm in my 25th session of the legislature, and I have been privileged to represent persons in my district. And one of the members said, well, you shouldn't be here. You should be back in Texas doing this and doing that and those sort of things. And I listened carefully. I'm here because this is the seat of democracy, and my people who I represent has a right to be able to vote unabridged, just like all of you. You may not want to recognize it, but we're supposed to have those rights. That's why I'm here. I'm here fighting for them, and I have the right to fight for them. And someday I'm hoping that I don't have to keep fighting this fight, and my grandchildren and my grandchildren's children will not have to keep repeating these struggles. I was born in Texas, and I can tell you just from my testimony as a child, my grandmother used to work and earn $2 a week working for the privilege. And out of those $2 a week, she used to save pennies and nickels to be able to buy a poll tax. The poll tax, as you know, was created to give people an opportunity to invest in public education support. But if you were white, the grandfather clause took care of you. You didn't have to pay the poll taxes. But my grandmother was African American, and she had to pay those poll taxes. And to pay $1.25, it was difficult to save money. My grandfather couldn't afford to buy poll taxes because they both couldn't afford to have poll taxes. It was too costly. She had to ride a bus to get to the poll tax, a place for colored people to go and vote. And it wasn't a short distance, and transportation was certainly not accessible as it is today. I can tell you, when I first voted, 60-some years ago, I had to buy a poll tax. And they did not exempt me as they did others. And Texas has had a poll tax, and we did not get rid of our poll tax until 1966, even though the law had been passed. I could not vote. My grandmother could not vote in the primary, Chairman Raskin. And you want to know why? Because she was black. And primaries was for white only. And it was not until Smith versus Allred, a case in Texas tried and won by Thurgood Marshall, that gave African Americans a right to have a say in their primary democracy. We're not talking about just something that you can go to the store and use for a little while and toss aside because you've gotten tired of it. We're talking about something that makes and breaks this country when we're talking about the democracy to vote. You're damn right I left Texas, and I'm glad I did. And you know why, Pete, I left them? I left Texas to give my people a right to be able to vote without them being infringed upon. I had a chance to vote during 2010 and 2012 when poll watchers came to my precinct where I vote personally. Let me tell you the chilling effect of that. They had people, Chairman Raskin, that looked like they was from the Proud Boys, walking, look at you like you were in the wrong place. In a minority area, that has a chilling effect. That chilling effect is depression of voting. I don't know what you call intimidation, but intimidation by any other name is still intimidation. It's intimidating, and the word gets out that these people are at your polls looking at you like they want to arrest you, keep you from voting. And people, as a result of that, do not go and cast their vote. I am the voice of my constituents. And if I had to walk to Washington, D.C. to get you to hear what I had to say, to fight for my constituents, I use any means necessary to get my point over. I meet with anyone that they allow me to talk to them about preserving and protecting the rights of my constituents to be able to have a say in their democracy. The governor's own Secretary of State said this: 2020 elections was the most transparent and secure elections. Now, she is not there anymore, but that was his Secretary of State.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Representative Thompson. I look forward to our questioning. Before I go to Representative Collier, I just want to recognize the arrival of Representative Mark Veazey from Texas, who's with us too. So welcome. Representative Collier, you're now recognized for your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Raskin and members of the committee. It's an honor to be here before you to provide information and to share our story about what brought us here to Washington, D.C. My name is Nicole Collier. I currently am elected to serve House District 95 for the last 5 legislative sessions. I currently am also elected to chair the Texas Legislative Black Caucus, which was founded in 1973 with 8 members. Today, we have 19 members. We are a bipartisan, bicameral organization with the goal in mind of addressing the issues affecting African Americans. I want to go back to some of the things that were talked about. And some of you may be asking, why did we ring the alarm? Why are we raising the concern about what's going on in Texas? Well, it's not just happening in Texas. It's happening across our country. We have seen a concerted effort in various states to pass legislation that would limit access to the ballot. It would not expand access, it would reduce access. And what is happening in Texas is no different. You heard about the Republican-appointed Secretary of State who said that the 2020 elections were smooth and secure, and yet we still found ourselves facing legislation to address the elections. I want to also point out some of the things that I want to respond to some of the things that were mentioned. Of course, there are some other legislation that was put on the call from the governor, one of them being critical race theory, which would whitewash the historic systemic racism that has happened in our country. Also is limiting access to legal abortion. That is also on the call. And I would remind everyone that the 13th check, our teachers, retired teachers, have not had a cost of living raise in years. And the Democrats have always advocated for additional funding for our teachers, including the 13th check. In fact, that same bill passed through the Democratic committee quickly and died in the Republican-controlled calendars committee. So we have stood for our teachers all along. Another thing that I want to remind you is that there was mention of the walkout of the quorum. That is a procedural method, just like the filibuster is in the Senate. If they don't like a procedure, a policy that's being presented in the Senate, they filibuster. That is just part of the rules, and that is where we have come to see. But what happened in Texas was that we tried to work with our colleagues. We provided amendments. Ms. T, which is Representative Thompson, sat through more than 23 hours of testimony. 400 people came and spoke against this bill, and yet only 65 for it. All the amendments that were presented by our Democratic colleagues were declined on party lines. In fact, there was a vote immediately following the hearing to pass this bill. So there was no interest, there was no even attempt to work and compromise and collaborate with our colleagues on this. Our backs were against the wall. There was no more discussion. We saw the writing on the wall just like it was during the regular session. I was on the conference committee for Senate Bill 7 during the regular session, and it's no different than what we saw in this special session. The bills that were filed would do more harm than good. They would limit access to the polls. You talk about, I've heard people say that we are opposed to voter ID. Well, let me tell you, Texas has been found to violate the Voting Rights Act of 1965 every decade since its passage. We cannot outmobilize racist gerrymandering. And when you talk about having somebody represent the interests of the people, it only reflects the racist gerrymandering that has been taking place in Texas. So we don't have people that represent the communities that they represent. We need to make sure that we have communities, they have to have the ability to represent, elect a candidate of their choice, someone that represents their values, and we're not doing that in Texas. I just want to talk about one of the provisions in the bill. Ms. T, and forgive me, say, for instance, she registered to vote 20 years ago. There's a provision in this bill that would require someone who is eligible to vote by mail to insert their last 4 digits of their driver's license or social security number or say they don't have one. Now, Ms. T may have registered 20 years ago. She may not remember which one she provided when she originally registered to vote. Under the provisions of this bill, if she put down the other number, even though it's the correct one, her ballot would be rejected. And there's no cure opportunity within this bill to cure her ballot, and she would not even know that her ballot had been rejected. So that's just one instance, and I welcome the opportunity to continue this conversation to provide additional information about why we sounded the alarm.
Thank you, Representative Collier, for your testimony. I'm sorry?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I would ask that you remind each of our witnesses that they have taken an oath to tell the truth. Subject to that, Texas had a COLA in 2013 for teachers. The gentlewoman has led us to believe there were no COLAs that were given, no updates.
Okay,
And that is, Mr. Chairman, that is a direct lie before this committee.
Okay.
That is not truthful.
Without entering to the merits of that.
Well, we need to, because there's no reason to give your opening oath.
Chairman, I'm sorry, I don't know what the procedure is. It's Congresswoman Tlaib, but that goes directly to her character. She should be able to respond to that.
Okay, well, you know what I'd like to do? I want to continue with the witnesses. Obviously, there's some factual difference in point of view about a teacher COLA raise. I'm not quite sure how apposite it is to our hearing. So let's keep going, and we can come back, and we'll clarify that. I'm sure there was no ill intent on either
Mr. Chairman,
side. Yes.
It's part of her testimony, and it was meant to mislead this committee.
Okay, and I'm sure that there will be a clarification if there was any misstatement there. Why don't we go ahead and recognize Representative Clardy, who's now recognized for 5 minutes for his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Raskin and Ranking Member Sessions and members of the committee for the opportunity to speak about election integrity in Texas. For the record, my name is Travis Clardy, and I'm proud to represent House District 11, serving the people of Cherokee, Nacogdoches, and Rusk counties in the Texas House of Representatives. The right to vote by a secure private ballot is a fundamental right in this country that should be protected, and the laws protecting our vote should be debated honestly and vigorously. And that is exactly what we've endeavored to do in Texas for the last 8 months. While I am grateful for the invitation to be here, I believe this conversation is best suited for the Texas House floor in our state capitol in Austin, rather than a Washington, D.C. committee hearing room. However, I must take some exception to the premise of why we were invited to testify. To be sure, there is no assault on voting rights in Texas. But there is, in fact, a real danger posed to our democracy. Not the well-intentioned and reasoned provisions in HB 3 to better secure our election processes, but instead the growing threat of practices too long tolerated that deprive individuals of voting for the candidates of their choice and diluting the essential democratic concept of one person, one vote. Moreover, while I appreciate the hard work and effort trying to pass a one-size-fits-all federal omnibus election bill, I am reminded of that familiar Texas adage to be leery of those who pronounce they are with the federal government and they're here to help. Texas has on her books a very strong and effective set of election laws and a dedicated group of election professionals that I believe can and should be the envy of every state and union. This is most recently reflected in the outcome of this Tuesday's runoff election for Congressional District 6 and the victory of our Texas House colleague, Jake Ellzey. Once again, Texas enjoyed a safe, secure, timely, and well-run election in which we can all take pride with trust and confidence. But first, let me say this to my Democratic colleagues there with you today. It's time to come home. Enough is enough. You've had your fun. It's time to get back to work. You know as well as I do, this legislation has been negotiated in good faith and deserves your attention. House Bill 3, the reason we are here today, is a sound and tailored bill to improve existing law. And like every bill, it can get better through debate and deliberation. But unfortunately, until our colleagues decide to come home, that is not possible. In Texas, we allow everyone to submit amendments to be argued during floor debates. It's an inclusive process that has served us well and is available to all those who want to participate. Simply put, we should want to make it easier to vote and harder to cheat. House Bill 3 expands voting hours. It makes it possible for voters to correct mistakes on their mail-in ballots. It penalizes vote harvesting, and it extends identification requirements for mail-in ballots. In fact, it is such a good bill that the professional associations representing our election administrators and our county clerks around Texas testified favorably that with a few technical process changes, they would change their formal positions from neutral to actually supporting the bill, which we all should want. Now, I would like to address some of the misconceptions that have made their way around the national media concerning House Bill 3. First, House Bill 3 does not limit hours of voting. Actually, House Bill 3 expands voting time from current law of 7 to 7 to 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., an increase of 4 hours per day. Further, employers are required to allow employees to vote or face criminal sanctions. Secondly, House Bill 3 does not eliminate curbside voting. In Texas, curbside voting is allowed for disabled and other eligible voters, an accommodation that allows these citizens to drive to the polls and participate in person rather than mailing in their ballots, which remains an option. Thirdly, poll watchers cannot intimidate voters. This bill does not permit voter intimidation, and observers cannot watch a voter actually cast his or her ballot, nor can they film election activity. Election observers can be ejected from the polling place if they interfere in the election process or commit a breach of the peace or violation of law. Fourthly, House Bill 3 does not allow mail-in ballots to be thrown out automatically. Rather, for the very first time, it allows for the voters to cure their mistakes so all valid votes can be counted. Fifthly and finally, House Bill 3 does not impose unreasonable burdens on voter assistance. It simply expands current law regarding the required information and the assistance oath before aiding the voter. But folks, let's make no mistake about it. Illegal voting does occur in the state of Texas, and it cannot be excused. We must have zero tolerance when it comes to voter fraud. Confidence in our elections, like faith in our judiciary and trust in our law enforcement, is vital to the perpetuation of the American experiment, and it is our best and utmost assurance for the survival of our republic. This is the duty we all have to our constituents and the oath that we all took to our Constitution, to our nation, and to our state. I believe we are all up to the task. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to answering any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Representative Clardy. We come now to Nina Perales, who's the Vice President of Litigation at the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. Ms. Perales, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Two bills currently pending in the Texas legislature, SB 1 and HB 3, seek to suppress minority voter participation and thwart the emergence of a more racially diverse Texas electorate. The Texas bills deprive Latino voters of lawful voter assistance. A significant number of Latino as well as Asian American voters rely on language assistance in the polling place from family members, friends, or neighbors. Article 6 of HB 3 requires voter assistors to swear under penalty of perjury that they will restrict their assistance to reading and marking the ballot. Article 5 of SB 1 requires the assister to swear that the assister did not encourage the voter to choose them. HB 3 and SB 1 both require the assister to secure a statement of eligibility from the voter. These voter assistance restrictions violate the Federal Voting Rights Act, which guarantees voters the right to assistance beyond just reading and marking the ballot, and also does not require a voter to explain his or her need for assistance. The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and Section 208 of the Voting Rights Act guarantee individuals the right to encourage a voter to rely on them for assistance and guarantees voters the right to choose assistors who encourage them. In addition, these bills create new paperwork requirements of assistors that will slow down the voting process and increase wait times at polling places in predominantly Latino neighborhoods. None of these provisions are based on any evidence that voters who need assistance are involved in fraud. Second, the Texas bills invite voter intimidation by poll watchers. Section 3 of SB 1 and Section 4 of HB 3 strip voters of the protections of privacy and security in the polling place and invite vigilantism by poll watchers. The bills empower poll watchers to roam around the polling place and stand close to voters while they are voting. At the same time, the bills punish polling place officials with up to a year in jail and a $4,000 fine for refusing to accept a watcher, even when the poll worker is concerned that the watcher is disruptive. Poll workers face the same penalties for positioning themselves to protect a voter from a watcher who is trying to intimidate that voter. Section 4 of HB 3 prohibits election officers from removing disruptive or even violent poll watchers unless the poll watchers commit a second infraction. This means poll watchers can scream, yell, physically impede, frighten, or drive off voters and must still be allowed to remain in the polling place unless they were previously warned and commit a violation again. These provisions ensure that not only will voters be intimidated by unrestrained poll watchers, but election officials will also be intimidated by the threat of severe penalties for stepping in and trying to protect voters from poll watcher interference. Latino voters in Texas have borne the brunt of more than a century of voter intimidation at the polls. There is every reason to believe that removing security measures inside polling places will result in more intimidation of Latino voters. Third, the Texas bills continue historic as well as recent racial discrimination in voting. Section 1.04 of Senate Bill 1, which was amended out of the bill after Maldif's public testimony, created a voter purge surgically aimed at disenfranchising naturalized U.S. citizen voters. This was the same voter purge launched by Texas against 98,000 voters in 2019 and blocked by a federal court order. Texas settled that case and agreed not to use this policy again, but SB 1 brought it back with the same predictable result of excluding primarily Latino and Asian American new citizens from voting. The 2019 voter purge was only the latest in a long history of discrimination against Latino voters in Texas. The U.S. Supreme Court in 2006 explained that, quote, Texas has a long, well-documented history of discrimination that has touched upon the rights of African Americans and Hispanics to register, to vote, or to participate otherwise in the electoral process, unquote. That case has since been followed by a U.S. Supreme Court ruling in 2018 that Texas had again discriminated against Latino voters. SB 1 and HB 3 are part of this recent and older history of racial discrimination and reflect a continued effort by Texas officials to suppress minority political participation. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions of the committee.
Thank you, Ms. Perales, for your testimony. And finally, we will hear from the Honorable Diego Bernal, who is, again, a representative and member of the Mexican American Legislative Conference.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for having us. The testimony of Representative Clardy and the testimony of Ms. Perales can't occupy the same space. And so what I thought I would do is walk us through the way a small section of the bill would affect a voter in real time in their life, to get away from the platitudes and more to the policy itself. And so here, let's say we have a voter who is 62. She prefers Spanish, isn't super comfortable with her English. Let's call her Senora Nicole. And she's always voted with an assistant, and in this case, the assistant would be me, her neighbor. I notice on election day that we haven't spoken, and so I go next door, knock on her door. She answers. Hi, Senora, it's Diego. Have you voted? She says she hasn't. Okay, well, let's go vote. I'll help you like I always do. Grab your keys, grab your chanclas, I always say. I'll bring the car out front, come out, and I'll take you to the polling place. And so we go. When we get to the front of the line, the first thing I encounter that's new as her assistant is a new form that I have to fill out. And that form asks for my name, my address, my relationship to the voter, and it asks that I attest that I haven't been paid by a candidate or a campaign or a PAC. I don't know what the form is for. I don't know who gets it. I don't know if it's private. It takes time to fill out. In a neighborhood like ours, which is primarily Latino, it might add to the line, the length of the line, but we power through that. The next thing we encounter is the oath of the assistant. There are 3 new things in the oath that this bill would require. The first, generally, is that it's now under penalty of perjury, which means that a violation of it, even without intent, would result in a state jail felony. The next piece asks me to affirm that she has represented to me that the only reason why I am her assistant is because she cannot see, read, or write. In the past, a voter assistant was able to help navigate the polling place, interact with poll workers, and answer questions. That is gone. All I can do now is simply translate. And I have to say under penalty of perjury that she has told me that is the only reason why I'm helping her. I've known her for years. We've never had that conversation. I'm not sure if I'm about to perjure myself. I don't know if I'm about to commit a crime. And so some people will stay beyond this point, but some people will go. Let's say we get past that part of the oath. There's a third part of the oath that says that I must attest and affirm that I did not coerce or persuade her, and in the Senate version it says encourage her to choose me as her assistant. And at that moment, I recall the conversation that we had on her front door. Senora, have you voted? Let's go. I will take you. I will be your assistant. Let's do it like we always do. Grab your stuff, meet me outside. Did I persuade her? Did I encourage her? Did I coerce her? I'm not sure. At that point, as I'm filling that out, I'm worried that I may have and am about to break the law. Again, some people will stay, but some people will go. Let's say we get past that part. And we go to the actual voting machine. There, let's say she's asking me a question, which she can't really do, but I'm just translating. All I can do is translate. That's it. I can't do anything else. I'm translating State Board of Education race and a school board race. It's difficult. We're not breaking the law. There's a partisan poll watcher in the polling place who now has free range and free roam to get close enough to any voter to see and hear election activity. That is the law. They don't know what we're saying, but they may not like it. They might not like the tone. They might not like the language. They might not like the way that we look. They are allowed to disrupt, to harass, to physically move, to push us away. And the only thing that the election judge there can do to them is give them a warning, because the law says, Article 4, Section 4.01, Section G, page 11, starting on line 15, it says that a partisan poll watcher can break the election code or the penal code. And the only thing that the election judge can do to them is give them a warning. The election judge can only remove them if they themselves saw a second infraction. It doesn't matter if everyone in the polling place saw it themselves and reported it. The judge has to see it themselves to remove that partisan poll watcher. The manager at Target has more latitude to protect their customers than an election judge in Texas would to protect voters under this bill. And some of the opponents may say, well, can't they call the police? Well, yes, they can. They can call the police. But that takes time. The police have to come and assess the situation. Voting at that polling place would stop or come to a halt. And just using my hometown of San Antonio as an example, there are over 300 polling places. The largest shift at any given time of SAPD is about 150 officers who have other and arguably better things to do. What happens to us? Do we finish her casting her ballot? If we do, does she want to come back if that's the new environment? What's the word of mouth when we get home as that experience spreads like wildfire, bad chisme? That can't possibly be who we are. And this idea that this bill makes voting easier, in this instance, I don't see how. There are no cases of voter fraud relating to voter assistance. In fact, just to give you numbers and I'll wrap up.
Please, you're over, so you can make your final point.
There are 154 prosecutions of voter fraud in the past 17 years in Texas. Out of 94 million votes cast, the likelihood of voter fraud in Texas is less than any one of us being struck by lightning.
Thank you, Representative Bernal, for your excellent testimony. Our members have been very patient, so I'm going to hold off on my questioning and allow Mr. Mfume to go, and then we'll go directly to the ranking member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you, as I have done privately, repeatedly, for holding this hearing and bringing us to this point. Your leadership on this is very, very important. And there is no real redundancy in talking about something so near and dear to the fabric of this society as is voting. I want to also thank the state legislators who've come here, those who are also on the Zoom with us electronically, for your participation, and if I might say also for your courage. This whole issue, Mr. Chairman, is an issue that there's been a lot of discussion about, but one of the things that's clear, and that is that unless we have real integrity in our system where everybody feels like their vote counts, we're never going to get to where we need to be. In fact, we will find ourselves repeating many of the problems and the issues of the past. Now, I don't want to be funny here, but this is almost like the old Yankee manager Yogi Berra once said, deja vu all over again. The issue of voter integrity, intimidation, and the burdens that are put on voters is something that's revisited itself in a mean and ugly way. Now, years ago, between the 1890s and the 1960s, there were real efforts at voter intimidation and denial. It all started, as we know, with the good old grandfather clause that said even though you may be free, you cannot vote unless your grandfather voted. Well, your grandfather was a slave, so he couldn't vote, and therefore you couldn't vote. And when that became so obviously ugly and intimidating, states changed up and created things known as the literacy test, where throughout that period of time, up until 1965, in many states you had to tell how many bubbles were in a bar of soap just to be deemed intelligent enough to go out and cast a vote. And when that came under further scrutiny, states changed it and said, okay, well, now you have to be able to recite the Constitution from beginning to end to be able to be qualified to vote. I just think that it is ludicrous for us to think that somehow now the things that we're facing, particularly in Texas and elsewhere, are not akin to the same laws that were put in place then with the same objective and the end result to suppress turnout and to, in many instances, deny the ability of all people to vote. Now, I know that these state legislators who are here have come here because they honestly and dearly believe in this concept of one person, one vote. So I was a little shocked earlier to hear accusations by some of my distinguished colleagues that the legislators from Texas ought to go back home and do what they were elected to do, like they were somehow abdicating their responsibility by, quote, denying a quorum. And yet, Mr. Chair, repeatedly in this committee and even on the floor of the House, there are attempts to deny a quorum because that's what you have the right to do. And you have the right to use every tool available as a legislator, whether you're in a city council, a state legislator, or in the Congress, to further your point. We do that all the time. So I think it's a little disparaging to suggest that these men and women are abdicating responsibilities when, in fact, they're using constitutional abilities and guidelines to do what they have to do. Mr. Chairman, I believe more than anything else that when we look at the disappearance of preclearance from the Voting Rights Act, when we look at all the problems that have started since then, we would not have been at this place had not the former president been declared the winner of the election in the state of Texas. That started an ugly ball rolling. And now all of a sudden there are these efforts to, quote, protect voters and protect their rights that did not exist, were not talked about, and did not get voted into law previously. This is a new phenomenon in an old ball game, and it's a phenomenon that, quite frankly, cries out for us to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and to pass H.R. 1, the For the People Act, so that we can put to rest once and for all these types of attempts. I've exhausted my time, Mr. Chair. I, again, want to commend you. I want to commend the legislators and want to remind my colleagues that as legislators, we have every right to use what's in the Constitution that we're governed by to advance our cause, even if it means denying a quorum. And I yield back, Mr.
Congressman Mfume, thank you for your excellent remarks, and I turn it over now to my friend, the ranking member, Mr. Sessions, for his time for questioning.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I'd like to engage perhaps Mr. Bernal or Mrs. Perales, please. Are ballots in Texas in the language that a person would need them to have? In other words, English, Spanish, Chinese, are they available?
Yes, sir.
So they're available in the language of people. That's not backwards. That's pretty important. I'd like to ask you, Mrs. Perales, you said that Texas really had been held in discrimination since for a number of years, and implied that Texas was discriminatory in their practices. But isn't it true that pre-clearance was required, and certainly the Clinton and Obama Department of Justice scrutiny of the bills that every time would relate to the laws and the redistricting of Texas would be reviewed by pre-clearance of Democrat and Republican Department of Justices?
Well, Representative, I'm not sure exactly what you're asking, but I will say that it depended on which president was in office at the time, but certainly doesn't subtract from the fact that when we brought these claims in federal court, and both of the cases that I mentioned were claims successfully brought by MALDEF, my organization, the U.S. Supreme Court held. That's not some administrative review by an agency. The U.S. Supreme Court held that Texas had, in its laws, discriminated against Latino voters. I'd like to add an answer to the one that was provided.
What year was that, ma'am?
Oh, well, the cases that I mentioned in my testimony, 2006 in a case I argued before the U.S. Supreme Court, and also in 2018 on a claim that MALDEF brought related to racial gerrymandering successfully against Latino voters in 2018. The answer that Representative Bernal provided earlier needs to have something added to it, which is that although Texas is forced by federal law to provide bilingual ballots, Section 208 of the Voting Rights Act requires a broader scope of assistance. And the Fifth Circuit tells us that in the case Organization of Chinese Americans. A bilingual ballot is not enough, Representative, and the courts have told us that. Voters who are limited English proficient have the right to take an assistor with them to help them navigate the polling place, interact with poll workers, read and understand.
Thank you very much. Mr. Clardy, can you please address that issue about what the bills that would be before us? I have a disabled son. I have been with him. He marked his own ballot, but I helped him. Could you please talk to us about what is before us with these bills related to what the gentlewoman speaks of?
Sure. In Texas, I think we have, and I'll use this word in its truest sense, I think very liberal laws. It as it relates to the disabled or people who be able to vote. So in the instance of your son, we have curbside voting. It'll be available throughout the state, all of our 254 counties, where they can drive up and an election official will come out and help assist and provide that ballot and help those people who are eligible for curbside voting to be able to vote. I think that's been our law for some time. Likewise, those individuals are available. They have the right, unlike most other states, I think, in the union, to cast a mail-in ballot. They register, they request the mail-in ballot, and it will come to them, and they can vote and have that returned. And if they choose to, they can actually bring it back in and have that ballot drop.
Thank you very much. Representative Clardy, are you aware of the social worker at a state assisted living center in Limestone County, Texas, where this person has been charged with 134 felony counts of acting as an agent of election fraud by putting in applications and forging signatures. Are you aware of that, sir? And would this be addressed in the new law? This happened in November of 2020.
Congressman Sessions, I'm not familiar with the specifics of that case. And again, as you know, it's really inappropriate for us to comment on pending matters, but I can tell you that in addition to that case, there's another pending, there's 50 cases pending right now. And that's just from the Office of Attorney General that have hundreds and hundreds of counts that exist. There's another approaching 400 cases are being investigated. Those 50 cases I mentioned, those have been presented to a grand jury and they've been true billed and indictments have issued. There's a case just north of me in Gregg.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent to engage in the record and place in the record these 400-some cases that are being presently handled in the state of Texas for voter fraud.
Great, without any objection at all under the,
Thank you.
the current voting fraud statute. I now would invite Debbie Wasserman Schultz for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Similar to what we see now in Texas, right after the 2020 election supervisors and Florida Governor DeSantis heaped praise on the election process. He said, quote, "The way Florida did it inspires confidence, and I think that's how elections should be run." Yet just a few months later, DeSantis changed his tune because Donald Trump was emotionally incapable of accepting the results of the 2020 election, and he needed to whip the fringe of his party into a frenzy to further his own aspirations. The result was a Florida voter suppression bill that mirrors what we see proposed in Texas, making voter registration harder, limiting voting by mail, and curbing the secure ballot drop boxes 1.5 million Floridians used in 2020. These blatantly anti-democratic bills are a solution in search of a problem, at the very least. During the pandemic, our state and nation experienced a rare expansion of ballot access. We not only allowed people to stay safe, but also gave flexibility to communities of color who too often face voting obstacles. Representative Thompson, it's so good to see you again. Harris County, home of Houston, which you represent, led the way in expanding opportunities to voting last year. So my question for you is, with all that Harris County did to make it easier for folks to vote during the pandemic, were there any resulting reports of voting irregularities that emerged later?
It's for you, Ms. Thompson.
I do not recall any, Debbie.
Okay, I don't recall hearing any either, and so it's helpful to have you underscore that. And Representative Collier, is it fair to say that these expansions were particularly valuable to Black and Latino voters in Texas?
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. We found that African Americans often have 2 jobs, and so being able to vote during the 24-hour period is very helpful. Being able to have drive-through voting is also helpful for those who have children. So these were mechanisms, and I'm not aware of any instances of voter fraud that have been prosecuted related to those mechanisms.
Thank you. The Texas legislation that we're discussing today, my friends, would create criminal penalties for local election officials who send absentee ballot applications to all registered voters. I mean, these are the priorities of the Texas state government, which Harris County attempted to do last year before the effort was blocked by the Texas Supreme Court. In Florida, Senate Bill 90 also prohibits local and state officials. They doubled down on what was already prohibited in Florida by saying that mail ballots could not be sent to voters unless one was requested. Ms. Perales, can you explain how communities of color are particularly affected by a restriction like this on mail-in voting?
Well, in Texas, we have mail-in voting available, just to be clear, for those who are disabled, can't get to the polling place, and those who are over 65. So we're talking generally among all communities about predominantly older population.
I'm sorry, just to be clear, I'm asking you about a restriction on not being able to proactively, for a local official to not be able to proactively send out a ballot.
Yes, and my point is that when you are an older individual, it can be particularly challenging to navigate the request of a mail ballot. A lot of folks don't have access online, and the process can be confusing. To have a local election official who can determine who is eligible affirmatively send those applications is going to particularly benefit Black, Latino, and low-income voters.
So here's the, thank you. Here's the icing on the cake of this legislation. Political parties in Texas would still be allowed to send out ballot applications, even as it's outlawed for local officials. So, Ms. Perales, how do you explain the discrepancy in treatment, and wouldn't the net result make it harder to vote? And then Representative Collier, if you were designing a bill to combat voter fraud, which should be all of our goal, obviously, if there really is voter fraud, would you have started by targeting local election officials?
With respect to making it more difficult to vote, yes. If somebody receives an application for ballot by mail and they want to fill it out and choose to fill it out, that is going to make voting more accessible for them. There is no reason on the face of the earth to prohibit a local election clerk who has all of the correct information from sending out ballot applications, and yet at the same time permit partisan folks within their organizations to be able to do that same mailing.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, can Representative Collier answer before my time is turned over?
Yes, and then your time is up.
Thank you so
Ms.
much.
Collier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would say yes, local control is absolutely important because those individuals who are on the ground have a better grasp of what is going on in their community and can address the needs of their community.
I appreciate it. I yield back the balance of the time.
I thank the gentlelady, and I now recognize Representative Nancy Mace for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank Ms. Thompson. I was a state lawmaker for 3 years before I came to Congress. I represent the 1st Congressional District of South Carolina, and South Carolina has had its own history, very bad history with Black South Carolinians, Black and Brown and African Americans. I recently took a vote to move statues like Supreme Court Justice Taney, removing his bust out of the Capitol Rotunda because he wrote the Dred Scott opinion, the one that said that Black and Brown and African Americans could not become citizens of the United States of America. I voted to move, someone like Wade Hampton, who encouraged the murder of over 150 Black South Carolinians during his run for governor. And so I appreciate your comments about the 60s. I was not around then, but I've watched and read a lot of the history and seen the videos and seen the moments of violence against Black America. So I applaud your work on that. My understanding is you were elected in 1972 in Texas. Is that correct?
It is correct.
Right, and I applaud you for making history, I imagine, in Texas and being a strong voice for Black men and Black women. Coming from South Carolina, we've got voter ID. And I'm assuming Texas is the same way. Do y'all need IDs to buy alcohol when you're purchasing at the store?
Yes, to be sure that you are capable of doing that.
Right. Do you need an ID in Texas to buy cigarettes?
You can't buy them unless you're at least 21.
But do you have to show an ID to buy cigarettes?
You do have to show an ID.
Do you need an ID when you're getting a job and trying to get on payroll in Texas?
Yes.
Do you need an ID to go to the pharmacy and get a prescription in Texas?
It depends on the prescription.
But do you need an ID for some prescriptions in
you
Texas?
do. Yes.
Do you need an ID to get Social Security services in Texas?
You do.
Do you need an ID to rent an apartment in Texas?
Yes.
Do you need an ID if you're going to buy a house and finance it via a mortgage in Texas?
Yes.
Do you need an ID in Texas if you're going to board an aircraft and fly commercial?
Yes.
Did you fly commercial or fly a private jet on the way to D.C.?
A chartered plane.
Do you have to show an ID when you fly in a private charter jet?
Yes.
I wouldn't know. I've never flown on one. So did you need an ID to get in the building here today?
Yes.
Do you need an ID in Texas to open a bank account?
Yes.
To cash your check if you're working. Do you know, Representative Thompson, what percentage of Blacks in Texas, Black and Brown African Americans, are registered to vote?
Oh, a huge percentage.
70%. Do you know what percentage of African Americans, black and brown Texans have voted on average or in the last election?
About 64%.
Correct. Do you know how many whites are registered to vote in Texas?
Far more than African Americans.
72%. You have 70% of blacks in Texas who are registered to vote. You have 72% of whites in Texas who are registered to vote. Do you know the percentage of whites who turned out to vote in recent elections?
I want to say over 50-some percent.
65%. Yeah. Do you know what percentage of Hispanics are registered to vote in Texas?
No, I do not.
63%. Do you know what percentage of Hispanics voted in the last election?
I think it was over 40%.
53%. Hispanics are not voting in as high a numbers as blacks and whites in Texas. Do you know the percentage of Democrats that support voter ID?
Would you repeat your question?
Do you know the number or percentage of Democrats who support voter ID in this country?
I do not, but I don't think it's a whole lot.
72%. Okay. Do you know the number of black and brown and African Americans in this country who support voter ID?
No.
75%. Do you know the number of Hispanics that support voter ID in this country?
No.
81%. Do you know where the state of Texas is ranked with black voter turnout in this country?
With black voters turnout?
Mm-hmm. Do you know where Texas is ranked?
Oh, about 44%.
The latest numbers that I read this morning was that Texas is ranked 10th. Do you know where Texas is ranked? So then top 10 in the country. Do you know where Texas is ranked with women voters?
Oh, way up in the 50s.
In the bottom third of this country. So I would argue that Texas has a more difficult problem with getting women out to vote than black and brown and African Americans. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go to Congresswoman Robin Kelly for her 5 minutes of questioning. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It is critical that we recognize that these voter suppression measures are not simply attempts to act on former President Trump's big lie. For years, Texas Republicans have tried desperately to blunt the impact of demographic trends that threaten their stranglehold on power. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, Texas is a very diverse state. Nearly 40% of its population is Hispanic or Latino, and almost